In May 2023, media giant Warner Bros. Discovery launched a multi-million-dollar marketing campaign to do the unthinkable. They took one of the most respected, bulletproof brands in the history of global entertainment, 3 letters that had been synonymous with absolute television perfection for 50 years, and threw it directly into the incinerator. They rebranded their flagship streaming service, HBO Max, to simply Max, a name that sounds like a neighbor's golden retriever, a budget gym chain, or a cheap data plan. Subscribers were furious. Wall Street analysts thought the executives had lost their minds. Why would a company voluntarily vandalize its own legacy? The leadership justified the move by claiming that HBO brand felt too elite and intimidating for everyday viewers. They wanted to flood the platform with cheap reality shows about house flipping, naked dating, and cupcake wars, and the legendary name was getting in the way. But to understand the sheer magnitude of this corporate schizophrenia, you can't just look at a single rebranding mistake. You have to look at a decades-long pattern of hubris. You have to rewind to a boardroom where the executives of this exact same network made the most expensive mistake in television history. Because the fall of HBO didn't start with reality TV. It started with a high school chemistry teacher standing in the desert in his underwear, and a corporate culture that had caught the worst of all business diseases, the God complex. To understand the collapse, you have to understand the empire. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, HBO didn't just make television, they were television. While basic cable networks were churning out endless, sterile soap operas and sanitized sitcoms with canned laugh tracks, HBO was broadcasting pure, unfiltered art. They had The Sopranos, they had The Wire, they had Sex and the City, they had mountains of subscription cash, zero reliance on advertisers, and an absolute monopoly on prestige. Their slogan was a flex of pure dominance. It's not TV, it's HBO. And audiences bought into it entirely, happily paying a premium monthly subscription to get access to content they couldn't find anywhere else. Nobody could touch them. If you wanted to watch something brilliant, or if you were a creator who wanted to make something brilliant, you went to HBO. And it was exactly this unshakable confidence in their status that became their curse. They genuinely believed that they didn't rely on great stories. Great stories relied on them. They believed their own hype so deeply that they stopped looking at what the audience actually wanted and started dictating what the audience should want. Picture this moment of absolute invulnerability. It's 2007. A pilot script from a relatively unknown television writer named Vince Gilligan lands on the desks of HBO executives. It's a gritty, dark story about a beaten-down, middle-aged high school chemistry teacher who gets diagnosed with terminal cancer and decides to cook crystal meth to provide for his family. What do the bosses of the great HBO do? According to Gilligan, during the pitch meeting, one of the network executives couldn't even be bothered to pay attention. He sat there, visibly bored, sighing, and looking at his watch. They passed. For their polished, elite brand, the idea felt too dirty, too marginal, too ugly, but missing out on one masterpiece wasn't enough. In a fit of that same corporate snobbery, they rejected the script for Mad Men, a stylish, slow-burn drama about 1960s advertising executives. They didn't believe a character study without mob shootouts or explicit violence would pull an audience. Shortly after, they passed on The Walking Dead, dismissing the zombie apocalypse concept as too gory and lowbrow for their refined, sophisticated viewers. 3 shows, 3 rejections. All of these projects were eventually scooped up by a tiny, unremarkable basic cable network called AMC, a channel that, until then, was mostly known for airing old black and white westerns and forgotten movies. The financial and cultural fallout was catastrophic. Walter White didn't just become a pop culture icon. Breaking Bad swept 16 Emmy Awards, entered the Guinness World Records as the highest-rated show of all time, and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in merchandising and syndication. Mad Men won the Emmy for Outstanding Drama Series 4 years in a row, redefining television aesthetics. And The Walking Dead became the highest-rated show in cable television history, spawning a multi-billion-dollar franchise ecosystem. HBO's leadership had single-handedly armed their greatest enemy. They handed a rival billions of dollars in revenue, absolute cult status, and the entire golden age of television on a silver platter. AMC took the crown of prestige simply because HBO decided their own taste was flawless. By the mid-2000s, HBO realized they had missed out on massive cultural touchstones. Their response wasn't to look for the next hungry, unknown creator like Vince Gilligan. Instead, they did what arrogant corporations always do. They threw an obscene amount of money at established, expensive names, assuming money equals prestige. Enter Vinyl in 2016. It was a drama about the 1970s New York music industry. The names attached were staggering. Martin Scorsese directing the pilot, Mick Jagger producing, a massive ensemble cast, and a budget of $100 million for a single season. HBO executives were so confident in the project that they renewed it for a second season before the first episode even aired. It was a disaster. The show was bloated, self-indulgent, and completely disconnected from what audiences actually cared about. Viewership plummeted week after week. Critics tore it apart for being a shiny, expensive cliché. The ratings were so abysmal that HBO had to do something unprecedented. They reversed their early renewal and canceled the show after one season, eating a $100 million loss. Vinyl proved that HBO had lost its golden touch. They were greenlighting budgets, not stories. They thought that simply slapping the HBO logo and Scorsese's name on a billboard would force people to watch. They confused expensive production design with compelling television. But the financial losses of Vinyl pale in comparison to how HBO handled the biggest intellectual property in the world. By 2019, Game of Thrones wasn't just a TV show, it was a global monoculture. It was printing money. George R.R. Martin, the author of the books, stated publicly that the show needed at least 10 to 13 seasons to properly tell the story. HBO executives were more than happy to fund 10 seasons, but the showrunners, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, wanted to move on to other projects, specifically a lucrative Star Wars deal. They insisted on wrapping up the most complex narrative on television in a rushed, 6-episode final season, instead of stepping in, protecting their multi-billion-dollar asset, and demanding a proper length, or simply handing the show over to new writers who actually wanted to finish the story. HBO leadership completely capitulated. They let two burned-out showrunners dictate the fate of their crown jewel. The result was Season 8, a cultural disaster of epic proportions. Character arcs built over a decade were destroyed in a matter of minutes. The writing was nonsensical. The lighting in the biggest battle episode was so dark, viewers literally couldn't see the screen. They even left a modern-day Starbucks coffee cup sitting on a table in the middle of a medieval fantasy scene. The backlash was biblical. Millions of fans signed petitions demanding a remake. The cultural footprint of Game of Thrones vanished overnight. HBO didn't just ruin a finale, they destroyed the rewatchability of the entire series by failing to manage their talent. They torched the merchandising, syndication, and long-term legacy value of a franchise that should have rivaled Star Wars or Harry Potter. As if the creative failures weren't enough, the corporate mismanagement of HBO in the late 2000s reads like a tragedy. In 2018, telecom giant AT&T acquired HBO's parent company, Time Warner. AT&T executives, who knew absolutely nothing about the delicate business of making art, marched into HBO headquarters and demanded a culture shift. AT&T executive John Stankey famously told the HBO team that they needed to act more like Netflix. They needed more hours of engagement, quantity over quality. The exact opposite of the formula that made HBO successful. But it got worse. In 2022, the company was spun off and merged with Discovery, led by reality TV mogul David Zaslav. Zaslav looked at HBO's massive debt and started a ruthless campaign of corporate slaughter to save money on tax write-offs and residuals. The new leadership didn't just cancel shows, they completely wiped them from existence. They took Westworld, a show that had won multiple Emmys, and defined HBO's sci-fi lineup and completely deleted it from their own streaming platform. They shelved fully completed $90 million movies like Batgirl just to claim a tax break. They sent a chilling message to Hollywood. We don't care about your art, your legacy, or your fans. You are just numbers on a spreadsheet. The trust that HBO had spent 50 years building with the world's best creators was deeply, irreparably fractured. Which brings us back to the ultimate insult, the transition to Max. By burying the HBO name to make room for 90 Day Fiancé and Dr. Pimple Popper, the executives committed the final act of brand dilution. HBO didn't collapse because of one bad decision. It collapsed because it started believing its legacy made it untouchable. First, lethal arrogance. When you sit on the throne, you go deaf. They assumed they owned the culture, totally blind to the fact that hungry rivals were already stealing it right out from under them. Second, the volume trap. They panicked at Netflix's numbers and traded curation for algorithmic slop. Nobody ever paid a premium price for endless scrolling. They paid for perfection. Third, brand suicide. You don't sell a Rolex by tossing it in a dollar store bin. Burying a 50-year legacy of prestige under cheap reality TV isn't an expansion strategy, it's corporate sabotage. In the end, it's the cruelest irony in modern business history. A network that, in 2007, considered itself far too elite and untouchable to air a masterpiece about a meth cook, ultimately erased its own legendary name, just to make it easier to sell reality shows about flipping real estate. You can have the biggest budgets in the entertainment industry. You can have a 50-year legacy, but when a corporation decides that sheer volume and tax write-offs matter more than a hard-earned reputation, that is always the beginning of the end.